We've recently been looking at Egypt as one of the Holy Lands and all the different scriptural counts. Why is it important to our spiritual heritage? We've seen how Abraham and Sarah made at least two different trips to Egypt because of famine. Whenever drought would hit the land of Canaan, people would escape from the famine to Egypt. Because of the Nile River, much of Egypt would be spared, and because they could grow crops along the river. And so people would go there for their livestock, for their lives, because there would be food and water still available. We've seen how Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph, was sold into slavery by his angry, jealous brothers. He ended up in Egypt and eventually became second in charge, second only to the Pharaoh. And because of his relationship with God, he was able to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams, which was God's message to the people, a warning. There would be 7 great years, 7 years of plenty, but then there would be 7 years of drought and famine. And because of this message, the people, and because of Joseph's leadership, the people were able to prepare and store grain during the years of plenty so that they could survive the years of famine. I want to continue with this Abraham line. Remember that Abraham was the father of Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac married Rebekah, and she gave birth to twin sons, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons. Remember, he married Leah and Rachel, and they each had their own handmaiden who would bear children to Jacob. And so in all, Jacob had 12 sons and a daughter named Dinah. I want you to look at this chart. And as you can see, these are the 12 sons and the daughter of Jacob. Now, Joseph was the favorite son of Jacob because he was the firstborn through his loved wife, Rachel. Now, these 12 sons, as you look across this chart, these become the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 sons, 12 tribes. And I just want to point out a couple things because while we're on this chart, there gets to be some confusion when the Bible lists the 12 tribes or the 12 portions of land in Israel. When you look at this chart, you'll see the 12 sons. And so those are the 12 tribes of Israel. And those are the named tribes early in Israel's history. Joseph, the tribe of Joseph, if you see a list that includes that, it's probably from early in Israel's history because on his deathbed, Jacob bestows a double blessing upon Joseph, which is passed on to Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, basically giving those two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, an equal portion of blessing, kind of on par with the rest of Jacob's sons. And so later in Israel's history, if you see the 12 tribes of Israel mentioned, and it doesn't include Joseph in the list, if you count, there's probably 13. 13 because Manasseh and Ephraim act as kind of half tribes of the one tribe of Joseph. So even though it's 12 tribes, there may be a list of 13. Now, when it comes to property inheritance, the promised land was divided into 12 portions. And because Manasseh and Ephraim would get one, that would have caused a problem, except that the tribe of Levi didn't inherit any portion of land because they were the priestly tribe. And so they received their sustenance and their place to live and their way to live through serving at the temple. And so you have 12 sons, 12 tribes, except when there are 13 listed. And the land is divided into 12 portions because Levi wasn't one of the tribes, doesn't get one. So crystal clear. But back to Jacob. His son Joseph, born of Rachel, was his favorite son, which caused big problems then, just as having favorite children causes big problems now. He was sold into slavery and ended up second in charge to the Pharaoh. Now, this famine would force all of Joseph's family to go to Egypt to buy grain, and eventually they would reconcile and end up there. They would be given the land of Goshen, which was the best land for their livestock. They were given that land because of Joseph's prominence and because the Pharaoh was so grateful for Joseph's leadership. And this is drawing an end to the story of Joseph and how we arrive in Egypt. And let's look at the end of Genesis for this. Genesis 39, 29 through 33. Then he charged them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were purchased from the Hittites. When Jacob finished charging his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Now here is a painting of Jacob on his deathbed, blessing the two sons of Joseph. Now, if you look at the clothing represented in this painting, it's probably not that of ancient Egypt, but rather reflects the time and culture of the artist Rembrandt, who painted it in 1656. So Jacob died in Egypt, but charged his sons with burying him back at the family tomb. Genesis 50, verses 1 through 3. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for so many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. Now, this is fascinating because it is the first of only 2 accounts of embalming in Scripture. The Hebrew people didn't practice embalming when burying their dead. They would place the deceased, they would wrap them in clothes or cloths of strips of linen, and they didn't use coffins. They would use ointments and perfumes as a tribute and honor, but they would bury them or place the bodies in caves or tombs, but no kind of preservation to the body. Going on, Genesis 50, verses 4 through 9. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb, which I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore let me go up, I pray you, and bury my father. Then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, Their flocks and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. Now, this makes sense why Joseph was embalmed. Jacob had made his sons promise to take him to the family tomb, to be buried there with his father and mother and grandfather and grandmother. And in this situation, embalming was very practical. It would have taken them 2 to 3 weeks at a minimum to arrive at this tomb, and carrying a dead body for that long in that part of the country, really in any part of the world, embalming would have made the journey a little better. Now, the other thing to notice in this passage is that this man was truly revered. Some of it obviously would have been for the sake of Joseph, but for the ancient Near East, if they loved Joseph because of his leadership in Egypt, the Egyptians would have really honored his father, because if you have a great man, you kind of, it stands to reason, well, he must be the product of an even greater father. And so they were honoring Joseph, but they were also honoring Jacob. And so you have members of Pharaoh's household, some of the Pharaoh's family, the royal family. You have the ones who are in leadership, the top leaders of Egypt throughout the country came. This would have been a huge party, a couple hundred or more people making this journey from Egypt back to the land of Canaan as part of this funeral trip. And just a few verses later, we read in Genesis 50, 22 through 26. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born upon Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath of the sons of Israel, saying, God will visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So like his father Jacob before him, Joseph also was embalmed. Now remember how large the funeral procession was for Jacob. Imagine how large it was for Joseph. He was second in command to the Pharaoh. I'm sure there was mourning and services to honor him throughout the country. Now again, Joseph was embalmed and placed in a coffin, which was not the Hebrew tradition, but these are the closing words of Genesis. Genesis 50, 22 through 26. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born upon Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath of the sons of Israel, saying, God will visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, just a few words on ancient Egypt embalming. They had already been practicing it for at least 1,000 years before this time. It really was a very precise and effective process. First, they would cleanse the body, they would wash the body, and then they removed any internal organs, and they removed all the organs from the body to preserve them, except for the brain and the heart. The other organs they would preserve individually and place in special jars, containers called canopic jars, and they would be buried with the body. The heart was left in the body because it was seen as the source of knowledge and life. Now, the brain, apparently they didn't think much of the brain. The brain was basically removed and discarded. The body would then be dried out with salt. They really wanted to preserve the body as lifelike as possible. So it would be dried out with salt, and then to maintain a lifelike nature, and because all of the organs and stuff inside had been removed, prevent the body from caving in, they would pack it with linen. And then the body would be wrapped in linen and alternated every so often layers of linen strips and this resin mixture. And they found through archaeology and excavations, they found there are different recipes for this mixture, but they all basically had 4 similar ingredients. There would be some sort of plant oil, like a sesame oil, some sort of plant root extract, some type of gum, a sugar-rich product like acacia gum, and then some type of a tree resin like pine sap. And that was the most important ingredient. And this mixture had antimicrobial properties which limited decay to the body. Now, you can see in this picture here, I have 2 pictures of a sarcophagus. This last one is another sarcophagus that I took this picture at the museum, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Now, when you look at this, often, these were mammoth, and there would be 2 to 4 of these, almost like Russian nesting dolls, that the body would be placed in a smaller one, and then that would be contained in the next size up, and so on, like Russian nesting dolls. Again, these would help to protect the body from the elements that would lead to decay. The other thing I want you to notice about the scripture passage is the way the book of Genesis ends. Imagine going along reading this in Hebrew, and you come to the final line. So Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. You'd be turning the page to see what happened next. He was put in a coffin in Egypt, and the "and" is found at the beginning of Exodus and leads us into the story of Moses. We've seen some of the good times that the Hebrew people found in the land of Egypt. Their lives were literally saved by Egypt, because when famine struck the land of Canaan, their lives could be sustained in Egypt. Now we're going to look at one of the darker times of the Hebrew experience in Egypt. Exodus 1, verses 8 through 11. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war befall us, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens, and they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. Now, there are a few one-liners in Scripture that have a story all their own. Passages that just at face value seem rather innocent. but really give way to huge consequences. And this opening passage that I read is one of those one-liners. The phrase, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph," would have devastating consequences for the Hebrew people who were still living in that land. Now, this king is not named, this Pharaoh isn't named. He forgot all that Jacob had accomplished, or perhaps he chose to forget. Instead of having this honor and gratitude toward Joseph and the Hebrew people, instead he was ignorant of the past, maybe willfully so, but he chose to ignore the past and instead was greedy. He was worried about his property, his land, his lifestyle being taken from him. And so he set in motion to put the Hebrew people into slavery. Exodus 1:12-14. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread about. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they made the people of Israel serve with rigor, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they made them serve with rigor. Now, this is a drawing to depict the Hebrews forced into slavery in ancient Egypt. While it's true that they were slaves, they didn't actually work on the Sphinx or the pyramids, as this drawing seems to suggest, or the old Charlton Heston movie seems to suggest. A couple things we know. First, the Sphinx and the pyramid were built several hundreds of years before Abraham, let alone before the Hebrew people became slaves in Egypt. But second, archaeological evidence has shown that it wasn't slaves, whether it's Hebrew or any kind of slaves, that built these structures. The pyramids were the burial tombs of the pharaohs. They didn't want slaves who were being forced to build them, to build these structures which needed to be precise, which needed to honor their lives. No, they needed people who were meticulous, who were craftsmen, who were the top of that society. In fact, they have found graves of people who were working on the pyramids, and they were elevated in society because of their craftsmanship, but they were also given the honor to have a burial place near the pyramids, and they wouldn't have placed the graves of slaves near the pyramids. It would have, in their minds, desecrated that area. It would have been these craftsmen. And so it wasn't the slaves who built those monumental things. Now, just a side note, one thing that was found in many of the tombs was mummified animals. Now, here's a picture of a decorative crocodile. And for a long time, scientists thought that the decorative crocodiles or cats or birds were just that, decorative. But then they x-rayed them and found that there were intact skeletons inside. These animals were mummified in the same process that the body was mummified. And these crocodiles represented power and strength. Sobek, you see in this image, was the Egyptian crocodile god. Now remember that ancient Egypt was a polytheistic country worshiping a multitude of gods. When we visited Egypt, we went to a household that still had this very ancient kind of practice with revering of crocodiles. They kept several crocodiles as pets, and we were invited in to take pictures. They were incredibly gracious and offered us hibiscus tea. Here is our group in the room, in the center of the room, are the crocodile cages. Now, hanging from the ceilings are several taxidermy specimens. You can see in this picture a jackal on the left and something brown with fur on the right. I'm thinking the taxidermy might have been done in-house. Now, here are a couple of the crocodile cages. These animals were revered, and when they died, they preserved their bodies, or at least their skulls, and they would keep these skulls and place them in places of honor around the house. Thanks for joining me. On Monday, we will begin the story of Moses and his interaction in the land of Egypt. Hope you have a great evening.